All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have a really special treat. I'm joined by a new guest to the show, Tavo San Abri. Hey, Tavo, how are you?
Hi, Dale. Really good to be here.
Yeah, awesome to have you. You sort of reached out about my good friend Paulogia, and you've kind of done a video evaluating his minimal witnesses hypothesis there, and that's why I wanted to bring you on to kind of discuss, because I think you did a really great job refuting and giving critiques of that theory there. But yeah, before we get into discussing the theory, I just want to introduce you to take a couple minutes to let you introduce yourself to the audience. You know, whatever you're comfortable sharing, your who you are, your background, maybe something about your faith journey if you're comfortable as well.
Yeah, sure. Let me start by saying that I don't have so you and Paulogia are very, very heavily theologically credentialed, and I don't have that same level of credentials. I am a university professor, but I'm in a very, very different discipline. My expertise in terms of my academic career is manuscript criticism. In my own field, I'm one of the most prolific manuscript reviewers in the history of the main journal for the field since they've been keeping records. So my expertise is in sort of criticizing ideas. It's not in theology by any means, but I really do respect your high level of information. And I've watched about, not only your videos originally and Paulogia's videos, but also your response videos to Paulogia, which I think there's about 5 hours of response videos there. So those were really educational. But so that's my academic background. Which is really just in sort of manuscript evaluation. And so I've kind of developed a skill set for critical thinking and for evaluating arguments. Now, my personal theological journey is kind of ongoing. I'll happily answer questions about it, but that's something that I haven't really done a video on, and the reason is because I sort of change from one day to the next, and certainly like when it comes to the bodily resurrection of Jesus as a doctrine, I definitely change I'm definitely not on the side of bodily resurrection at the current moment right now, but I think that makes me a fairly good impartial person for evaluating these arguments in a way that's dispassionate and at least fairly neutral. I'm definitely not a hard-boiled atheist. I have been an atheist for almost all my adult life, and sort of being a more reluctant believer in theology is definitely a very new transition for me.
Fair enough. Yeah, I did notice that in your video with Paulogia, it was sort of an interesting note whereby let's, for the sake of argument, say that the bodily resurrection is in fact true, or it is the biblical position. You kind of think, even still, it's not an essential doctrine. Like someone like Dale Allison or someone like yourself and stuff, that you could still be saved even if it turns out you're wrong about the bodily resurrection. That's fair enough to say there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I really admire Dale Allison. I think he's got an interesting set of personal theological insights as well as his academic background, and I think one informs the other. I also think, though, that you can kind of separate the two. I think a lot of people who go into this dialogue and go into this debate come at it from a very, very personally vested perspective. Like, for instance, like if you have somebody like Richard Carrier, he'll say, like, I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist first and foremost, and everything that I do in a scholarly setting is to advance the cause of atheism. I think if you're going into this debate from that perspective, then that's inherently almost unscientific, right? Because you should just say, I'm just going to look at the evidence dispassionately and see where it leads me. You shouldn't say, I'm going into this debate because I believe firmly one way or another, and I'm going to filter all the evidence I find through that belief system.
Absolutely. Yeah, awesome. All right, well, let's transition to the main guy, Paulogia himself. And the first thing, as you know, you've seen the video, so he and I have been kind of engaging back and forth, and he's been engaging a little bit with Gary Habermas and his new books on the resurrection and that sort of thing. And I kind of felt that he's been a bit unfair and nitpicky against Gary in his criticisms. And taking him out of context, not being charitable and that sort of thing. But I just want to turn it to you. Obviously, you're not one of these. You're not a biased evangelical Christian by any means. So, what's been sort of your take on Paulogia, his take on the whole Gary Habermas and his 4-volume Resurrection series in general?
Dr. Habermas, obviously incredibly insightful, incredibly prolific scholar, huge amount of admiration for that individual. Paulogia also very, very persuasive, very, very eloquent, extremely articulate. I think he's got a very cohesive worldview. I respect both of them quite a bit. I do agree that sometimes I think what happens is Paulogia, we'll get into this in the individual issues, but sometimes Paulogia does like sort of sneak in a word here or there that really sort of colors the argument heavily. And I think that's kind of a habit that I maybe take some issues with. I don't know that he's doing that purposefully. I think it's just that things are sort of filtered and colored through his perspective. I will say this, that I think the atheist community in general has a very significant problem in that there are relatively few natural-born atheists who are involved in the argument. It's almost exclusively people who come from a very evangelical, fundamentalist Christian background. So the problem with that is that a lot of their arguments are almost sort of baked into sort of debating against a straw man. I find this to be a problem with Bart Ehrman as well, and I know that Bart and Paul collaborate a lot, although I have a lot of respect for Bart Ehrman as well. But, he comes from a perspective of, evangelical fundamentalism is wrong. But essentially, if you take his arguments at face value, you have a really, really strong case against evangelical fundamentalism, a very strong case against the verbal and plenary interpretation school of thought around the New Testament, and the Old Testament for that matter. But you don't, I think if you apply that to anyone who has any theological belief, then it comes back a little bit more tenuous. And the reason is because, again, he's really arguing more persuasively and more cogently, admittedly, against a very hard line version of Christianity, which doesn't, to me, apply to sort of every version of theology and every version of Christianity. I hope that makes sense. But I think this is an issue with Paul. Paul also came from a very evangelical, very fundamentalist background. A lot of atheist thinkers have had that sort of experience where they went from very, very hardline Christianity to atheism. And I think that does set up an avenue for biases, because their experiences were obviously very filtered by a school of thought that really highly discourages any critical thinking, any real review of scholarly information. Now, I hope that doesn't sound like too much of a dig on fundamentalist traditions, but it is something that worth considering and noting.
Yeah. Well, you had me gritting my teeth for half a second there, but oh no, it's all right, cool. Yeah, well,
no, but I really respect your background as well. And if people haven't dived deeply into your theology, I think it's a really an interesting topic, and I hope that we get into that at least a little bit, because I was interested in some of your because you really came at Christianity from a more Bayesian perspective, and you've worked with I understand you're very good friends with Dr. Habermas, and you've worked extensively together. So that's very interesting to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I look forward to that coming up. And, obviously I do want to kind of get started. Basically, you've seen my videos, right? Because I did, originally I did sort of an ad hoc video on Paulogia, admittedly one where I didn't put a lot of time and effort into considering what his hypothesis was. And Paulogia rightly sort of scolded me on that in one of his videos. And that prompted me to create the Paulogia Project, where I did my darndest to representing him accurately in terms of his minimal witnesses theory, and in the most charitable light I possibly could. And on that front, in the first place, I just want to clarify with you, because I have had skeptics saying, well, you don't understand the purpose of the minimal witnesses hypothesis. And from my point of view, I watched video after video. I think he's crystal clear that his goal is just to provide a possible naturalistic account for each of the 12 mundane events that he has. He's not trying to argue for the most probable explanation. He's not even trying to argue that his hypothesis is plausible. He just wants something that's possible. And I'm just kind of curious, because I have had his fans come back and say, no, that's not what he's arguing. So, like, what's your understanding of the goal for the minimal witnesses hypothesis?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that's the reason why when I posted my video, I said this is not a direct refutation. This is really more of a criticism, and the reason why that's important is because if you take Paulogia's argumentation as, this is that he's arguing against theology broadly and he's making a case for atheism, I think it's much, much weaker. If you take it as a direct refutation of Dr. Habermas's facts, and like kind of a one-to-one refutation, then I think it becomes more persuasive and more cogent. And the way that Paulogia uses it is a little bit variable. I've got his article up and I'm looking at it right now as we're talking. And when he sometimes says this is just an argument against Dr. Habermas, and he's applying it in a very, very narrowly delineated way, I think the argument comes off as more persuasive. But, he had a debate with Mike Winger where he took his minimal witnesses argument and just applied it to sort of the resurrection in general and theology in general and Christianity in general. And there I think it becomes much weaker. So if his contention is I'm answering, and then the other reason why I think this critique is important as a critique is because his arguments do get brought into the debate elsewhere in the lay public sphere in a way that is less narrow. So I that was one of the motivations for me in making my video. I wanted people to know that that if you broadly apply Paulogia's argumentation, then you're going to end up with a more tenuous case. And so, for instance, like Paulogia is a little bit more mindful and maybe a little bit more tempered in how he talks about post-bereavement hallucinations in his own words from time to time. But sometimes that argument gets carried out by other atheists in a way where it's very, very definitive. So, and I know we'll get into that later, but that's why I think it's important to note that my argument is more of a criticism than a refutation. So if he's applying his argumentation narrowly, I think it's more persuasive. If he's applying it more broadly as an argument against Christian theology in general, I think it becomes a little bit weaker.
Yeah, I totally agree. But even my conclusion, look, I've heard from so many skeptics, even scholars like Richard Carrier, claiming that Paulogia's minimal witnesses hypothesis is the best online that the atheists can come up with, and that sort of thing. And in my evaluation, I'm just shocked. In the first place, I can think of way better theories than what he did, even with the narrower goal. I mean, I think James Fodor's theory does way better, for example, or because I found that he doesn't even account for some of the minimal facts of Gary Habermas's. He makes these boastful claims that, hey, my theory accounts for all 6 of Gary's minimal facts. But actually, when you compare the minimal facts to his 12 mundane events, he can't account for at least 2 or at worst 3 of the 6 minimal facts. So I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that his theory is the best out there? And is this really the best atheists can do? They can't account for all the facts?
I mean, I personally think it's the best, if not one of the best, and it's up there. And I think that in itself is telling, because there's 2 points I want to make. Number one, if this is the best argument that we have after 2,000 years of wrestling with, the original narrative of what happened around first century Judea, I think that's very telling, because there's still major, major gaps, right? So if there's so many gaps after 2,000 years, and this is the best we've come up with, or at least even close to the best, I mean, I think that's at the very least telling and sort of an intriguing insight. Number two, a lot of the statements that I have against Paulogia's blog article and a lot of his posts around minimal witnesses are equally applicable to Dr. Habermas's original framework. And the reason why is I think that there is sort of a bit of a hyper-focusing on the resurrection. Now, as I say in my own video, and I know we'll get into this, but as I say in my own video, it's important to note that the resurrection was only a significant event contextually, right? If I died tomorrow and then I appeared to 12 people, nobody would care. Nobody would be arguing about my death 2,000 years from now. It just wouldn't matter at all. So you have to take the context of Jesus as a teacher, Jesus as a healer. I think if you're just zooming in and hyper-focusing on the resurrection and say, that is the reason why I cling to Christian theology, I think that's at least an incomplete perspective. And I realize that some of your theological journey was through more specific Bayesian analysis. So I don't want to be too critical of Dr. Habermas, but I do think if you focus on the resurrection too much, then you miss the larger context of who Jesus was. And really, the resurrection only makes sense as a significant event in human history if you, and I'll say the apparent resurrection rather than the resurrection, just to keep my perspective more neutral. But it only makes sense if you have the context of Jesus. Does that make sense? Like if, in other words, if this happened to anybody else, nobody would care. The only reason why we're still talking about it 2,000 years later is because we have someone who is, by any measure, really a stunningly insightful and very radical teacher who really changed theological experiences for a lot of people around him. So I think my point is this, that some of the overarching overview criticisms that I have of Paulogia's perspective are equally applicable to Dr. Habermas if we're sort of hyper-focusing on the resurrection. And I realize that Dr. Habermas's perspective in general is more broad, so out of context, that may sound like an overly critical statement.
Yeah, no, and that's what the fourth volume is all about, right? Like that's why he's focusing on that to kind of, okay, great, we've got the resurrection. Now what? What's entailed by that? What are the implications and stuff? So yeah, you're totally right. And that's why he's coming out with that fourth volume there. And yeah, I also agree with you that, when we're identifying miracles, there's a reason why philosophers, which is my field, in the philosophy of miracles, you need that important religious context. And in my case, I'm even more specific. I think with Jesus and the case for the resurrection, it's a religious authenticating context, meaning it's within the context whereby it can serve to authenticate a religion. And that really is a game changer when you're considering, the prior probability issues in Bayes' theorem and stuff like that. But I'm just sort of curious, before we turn to his theory, like one of Paulogia's issues, as many atheists and skeptics online, they have this sort of almost religious dogma understanding that, hey, if I can just provide a possible naturalistic explanation, I don't care how improbable it is, no matter what, it is by definition more probable than a miracle. And that's what I think Paulogia's goal is that's why he thinks, hey, if I can just prove this narrow goal, that's sufficient, because a miracle by definition is so much more improbable compared to anything else I could cook up. What are your thoughts on something like that in terms of the prior probability of a miracle itself?
Yeah, so I have two very specific thoughts. Number one, you touched on a really important point. I was very influenced by the writings of Martin Luther King, who has a very, very interesting take on Christian theology, and it's very nuanced. When he was younger, he really did struggle with a lot of doubts around Christian theology. So he didn't start off as a very hard-boiled fundamentalist. And a lot of his original ideas, and this has been a little bit misrepresented in some of the quotes that you find from him online, so I don't want to be I'm going to be kind of cursory, and then I'm going to encourage people to do their own research. But one of his important insights is that Christianity does do a bad job of overemphasizing the miracles of Jesus and underemphasizing Jesus as a teacher. You know what I'm saying? So for me, my initial experience towards Jesus was, I was actually a mythicist originally when I started, because the first lectures that I absorbed on the historicity of Jesus were from Richard Carrier. So second, after that, I sort of started reading the New Testament, and I was reading about Jesus as a folk hero, and then I really became sort of intrigued by the teachings of Jesus. And I was like, wow, this guy's teachings are way, way ahead of his time, probably centuries ahead of his time. Robert Cole, who's a Harvard professor, said that Jesus was a moral and ethical genius. So I do think that the apologetical side of the debate does underscore miracles far too much than, and then doesn't emphasize as much the fact that Jesus was an insightful teacher. So, if you look at Buddhist traditions and Hindu traditions, in Buddhism, there's some sects that believe that Jesus was a bodhisattva. In Hinduism, there are some sects that believe that, Jesus was a yogi or an avatar. This is exceedingly uncommon for any other religious figure. You're not going to find like some Jews who believe, I think Muhammad was a prophet. Like that's a very, very exceedingly uncommon insight, right? And those, so I guess my point is that Jesus has an appeal as a teacher and as a philosopher and an ethicist that really transcends the boundaries of Christianity. And I think that's really what intrigues me and draws me in. So to me, in some ways, that I have friends who are like Buddhist and Hindu and of other religions, and I've read the Guru Granth Sahib of Sikhism, and I've read the Talibi Akbas of Baha'i. And so to me, what's really persuasive is that Jesus was a really, really insightful teacher, and I think that should be kind of the first thing. So when I talk to people who are not Christian, I say, don't start by getting into the debate over the resurrection. Start by looking at Jesus as a teacher, because I think that's maybe, it's an underemphasized point. And I had a second point that I was going to go into, but that was already a long rant, so maybe I'll just cut it off there.
Yeah, no problem. Do you want to bring up that quickly, the second point?
No, because I lost my train of thought.
Okay, so, no worries.
I'm sure we'll get to it, though. Yeah.
Sounds good. So, okay, so let's get to the fun part. Let's get to the meat and potatoes of this podcast. Let's evaluate Paulogia's minimal witnesses hypothesis in light of his stated goals, but then also, even more importantly, based on your analysis. So, how each one stacks up as being proven true historically and that sort of thing, or how does it measure up in terms of truth, kind of thing. So I'll just try to share my screen here and pop up Paul's.
I've got his article pulled up. Okay, yeah, we've got the same article pulled up. So okay,
gotcha. All right, so yeah, what we're going to do, let's go through each of the 12 mundane events, as Paulogia says, and when relevant, I'll compare that to the Gary Habermas minimal facts. But yeah, let's go through each of these in turn. So, okay, so the first mundane event, Paulogia's theory, is in the early 1st century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth. So yeah, what's your take on this? Is it a fact? And also, is Paulogia providing a possible account for a minimal fact or an established fact of history with this?
Yeah, we can kind of skip over this point, but I do want to not gloss over the fact that I don't personally take Jesus as much as an apocalyptical preacher. Now, this is probably a topic that deserves its own video, but the most potent arguments for saying that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher are the ways that Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is imminent, or the kingdom of God is imminent. And now he says this a lot, but he, when he talks about the kingdom of God, he likens it to a lot of different things that are very analogous, that are so a lot of what he gives is parables, and he says these parables are analogies for the kingdom of God. So it's not clear to me that he really does mean, hey, this is the eschatological event that we've expected throughout history. I think his point is that I will bring about the kingdom of God, and what he says could be very metaphorically analogous. But I don't really think of Jesus as much as an apocalyptical preacher personally. I realize it's a controversial take, but I think this is a topic for another video, because I don't think it's related to overall how I take the rest of Paulogia's argumentation. But I will say that if you look throughout history, especially in times of adversity, there is a much higher incidence of apocalypticism. So the reason why that's important is because there was a sense of apocalyptical disappointment, first around the death of Jesus, and second of all around the year 70 CE when the Second Temple was destroyed, and then probably later in the 4th century as well. There was another epoch, but there history is dotted with these episodes of high apocalyptical expectations, and we just had one just a couple of months ago. So there was this guy in Africa who had prophesied the apocalypse. So my point is this. We shouldn't read into the high apocalyptical expectations of 1st century Judea as an indictment specifically of Jesus as an apocalyptical preacher. So I guess my point is, let's not overemphasize the degree to which Jesus was an apocalyptical preacher, but that's maybe a topic that deserves its own separate video.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So now we come to number 2, right? So this one does correspond to one of Gary's minimal facts. So basically, this Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time. Now, I know that I agree this is a historical fact. I'll let you give your take in a second. But the main thing is, for Paulogia's theory, in terms of its stated purpose, I gave it a check mark, right? This is a fulfilled, right? Gary's minimal fact, first one is Jesus died due to the effects of Roman crucifixion. And I think Paulogia's theory is acknowledging this. So obviously it accounts for it. But yeah, do you have anything? I think this is relatively uncontroversial, but what's your take on this second mundane event of Paulogia's?
Yeah, I mean, I think in and of itself, this is fine, and the way he's worded it is technically true. I think it does sort of underplay the role of Jewish theology in the indictment of Jesus initially. And the reason why that's important is because we do have like the Sanhedrin Talmud 43a, which goes into the fact that Jesus was seen as an apostate, as enticing Israel to apostasy, to false idolatry. So I do think that the Jewish theological context is important here. We have, I think there's Sanhedrin 102a, which goes into, Jesus being submerged in boiling excrement for all eternity. So there was clearly a very acerbic Jewish response towards Jesus. So again, I don't want to oversimplify Jesus' crucifixion as being purely a challenge to Roman authority, and that's what Paulogia says on this blog. But again, otherwise, like you said, I'm fine giving this a check mark.
All right, fair enough. All right, cool. So now we come to something that was in your videos. This isn't necessarily one of Gary's minimal facts about the burial and empty tomb of Jesus, but for Paulogia, so mundane event number 3 is the resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers. And this is something I know you addressed in your own video critiquing Paulogia. So I'll turn it over to you. Obviously, Paulogia's theory doesn't need to account for anything here because Gary's minimal facts don't include the burial and empty tomb of Jesus. But just in terms of the truth of the matter, what's your take on this event?
Yeah, so I've made a whole video around the empty tomb because I think the argumentation is persuasive. I think that there's at least one word in this that I think is a single word, but it's very significant, and that's the word secretive. So that's in the 4th paragraph at the end of the, so that Jesus would have been in the graveyard of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner. There's no evidence that the grave of Jesus would have been secretive. I think dishonorable speaks to a lack of veneration, but there's no reason to think that the grave of Jesus, under any tradition, under any stretch of the imagination, would have been secretive. So in other words, there wouldn't have been a need to keep the grave secret. Okay, so that's first of all. Second of all, it does miss an important aspect of the context here again. And the reason why this context is important is because there was a specific burial practice that was very common in first century Judea. Jesus died around the peak of this burial practice. We know about this burial practice from archaeological evidence from the grave of Yehohanan ben Hagkol, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, the grave that was found in 1968 in Jerusalem. So we know that Jesus died during the peak of this practice of being placed in a rock-hewn tomb, right? Followed by your bones being placed in an ossuary box. So there was a primary and a secondary burial. So there were 2 types of burials that were endorsed by the Jews. Number 1, you had to have your own grave site. Okay, or if you were in a rock-hewn tomb and then later placed in an ossuary box, then there had to be a procedure for that, right? So I think some of Paulogia's arguments seem to say, well, Joseph of Arimathea is very implausible because why would he have given away his family tomb? He was giving away a place in his family tomb. That's a big sacrifice. I think my counter argument is it's not really that big a sacrifice. What he would have done is he would have said, okay, we can put the body of Jesus in this rock-hewn tomb for a period of 1 year, and then we'll move Jesus' bones into an ossuary box. That probably would have been the understanding if Jesus was buried using the most commonplace burial practice of that specific era, right? So Jesus was born at the peak of this, rock-hewn tomb and then ossuary box. But let's say that Jesus was placed in a grave. So number 1, it's important to note this would not have been a common grave. So now in my video, I go into a lot of the second paragraph of Paulogia says there's a lot of different hypotheses here. So the second paragraph goes into the hypothesis that Jesus' body was merely discarded, was eaten by animals. I think that's very, very unlikely. My whole video goes into why that's unlikely. I think one of the important reasons is because Jesus died in or around the Passover, when the population of Judea was really more there were a lot of people squeezed into that population, and I think the task of keeping the peace would have was extraordinarily high during that period. I think a lot of Paulogia's analysis about humiliating Jews who were crucified or who rose up against the Roman government. That sort of anachronistically takes the ethics of the year 70 CE and beyond and places it on the Jews. In other words, before the Jewish War, before that big uprising in 70 CE, the interest that the Romans had was in keeping the peace. This interest would have been heightened and would have been more acute in the year 30 CE, especially around the time of the Passover, especially because we know that there were other big riots that broke out over much, much lower defilements. And so we know that there was a Roman interest in keeping the peace. So I think defiling the grave of somebody, or the burial of somebody who had a lot of notoriety speaks against this idea that Jesus would have been left to be eaten by animals. So, and then, I think saying that there was a common grave is also essentially just as bad as that argument. It just misses all the context of Josephus saying you have to have individual graves. The Mishnah says you have to have individual graves. The Old Testament goes into a lot of detail around burial practices. Philo of Alexandria says, to not have individual graves would have been, an outrageous practice. And there's a lot of other statements that sort of contradict this idea that Jesus was just placed in a mass tomb. So there's a lot of scenarios given in this heading. I think none of them are that realistic. I think probably the most persuasive one, if I had to pick from these, would be that Jesus was placed in a grave of the condemned. But even in that grave of the condemned, you're not just thrown into a pit. You still have to have your own burial site. And there's no reason to think why that grave would have been secretive. So it would have been customary to not venerate that grave. So you couldn't have a lot of whatever veneration would have been done at the time. But there's no reason to think why the grave of Jesus would have been secretive. And there are certainly, and there's a lot of reasons to think, and this is, by the way, not even getting into all the, evidence in the Bible that says that, that start with the problem of the empty tomb, right? And this is also, and I think Paul talks about the empty tomb. Paul talks about a burial. I know that gets glossed over a lot. But when Paul talks about the death of Jesus, he does use the word burial. The word that he uses for burial implies interment, and it also implies funerary rites. So when Paul talks about the burial of Jesus, I know some people, I get told this a lot in online debates, but Paul does specifically use the word burial, and he also uses a specific word that really specifically implies interment of the body of Jesus. So I'm not even getting into all the New Testament arguments that suggest that there is an empty tomb. I also think it's at least relevant to know that I've read about 8 versions of the Toledo Yeshu, and there's hundreds of different versions, and all of those versions all start with the problem of the empty tomb. So I feel like at least one of those versions, if the body of Jesus was merely discarded, would have said, look, the body of Jesus was just thrown out. That's why nobody, that's why there was no tomb. We just threw it out. But none of those versions start with that, right? All of the versions start with, well, the disciples stole it, the gardener moved it, somebody else moved it, there was a Weekend at Bernie's scenario. So I realized that was a bit of a long answer, but I'm distilling about 2 different videos, each of which are about 30 minutes long, into what it was, and I at least endeavored to be a brief answer. So hopefully that answers your question. But I see a lot of problems here. The one word that I would take the biggest issue that I think is the most clearly falsifiable is secretive.
Awesome. Yeah, and that wasn't too long at all. Like, I like these in-depth answers. My audience likes these as well. So yeah, you did a great job on that. And I just have some general follow-ups. Like you said, I did want to ask, what about what did you make of some of Gary Habermas in his volume 1? Some of the reasons he presented for saying, the empty tomb. Look, even if it doesn't qualify as a minimal fact, I think Gary has done a head count for that and proven 80.1% of scholars that he's read their literature from, they all accept the empty tomb as a historical fact. And, you're familiar with some of the typical reasons, like women being the ones to discover, the criterion of embarrassment. There's also the archaeologists, the archaeological evidence from people like Joan Taylor, who was a former skeptic. And it was through the archaeology, she thinks she's actually excavated the site of where Jesus' empty tomb was. What's your take on stuff like that? Are those good evidence? Good evidences? I'll say evidences plural because I know the atheists love it when you say that.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to gloss over a lot of beliefs that are sort of widely reported by apologists. So when apologists get into the criteria of embarrassment, all this other stuff, the women witnesses, We'll get into the Jewish practice of witness testimony in a little bit later, but I tend to gloss over some points that I feel like people have heard a whole bunch of times. But I mean, I certainly don't. I certainly wouldn't dispute that. But yeah, I think has Dr. Habermas published the raw data of his survey?
So he's published volume 3, which is it's part of his raw data. So it's incomplete because the publisher wouldn't allow him to basically. He wanted originally to publish all 1,500 pages, but they basically forced him to reduce it down to half the size, kind of thing. So yeah, it's part of it.
Well, everything that I'm citing is, you know, I'm not a theological expert, you know, so I in my video I go into a lot of detail around this, and I put up all the quotes from Philo of Alexandria, from Josephus, and from all the relevant Jewish testimony. So I would encourage people to still do their own research, and I mean I don't 80% to me sounds like it's a little high, but I would have to read volume 3 of Dr. Habermas's statement around this. Now, it also depends on what his pre-selection criteria were, because, you know, if you consider like anyone from seminary and expert, then obviously you're going to have a bit of, you know, I don't want to speak too specifically on what his methods may or may not have been, but to me, I think the empty tomb is very, very difficult to argue. I think the best argument of the empty tomb is that it's not likely because it's miraculous. Okay, but again, my retort to that is that you know, the empty tomb itself is not a miraculous event. If I were an atheist and I wanted to make a strident case against the resurrection, I would start with a contention that somebody stole Jesus' body. You know, I that's what I would start with. You know, I think that's a much more persuasive case for atheism. You have a bunch of a bunch of Jewish tradition and polemic responses that say, yeah, somebody stole the body of Jesus, somebody moved it, that the gardener moved it, that the disciples stole it. There's even sort of a Weekend at Bernie's scenario where they took the body and they propped it up somewhere and like kind of marched it around to show people that Jesus was still alive. Now, that's not very persuasive in and of itself. But if I were an atheist, I would start with the argument that, hey, this was likely a conspiracy. Somebody likely stole the body of Jesus. And I think that's a much more persuasive case. And I'm a little surprised that I don't hear atheists making that case more often. But anyways, to me, the empty tomb is very, 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 very well attested.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. For what it's worth, look, if I was, you know, I said I could easily, if I put on a skeptic's hat, I could easily come up with a better theory than Paulogia's and stuff like that. And I think that the empty tomb is such a well-established historical fact, given the evidence, that, but it's on an explanatory level. Even Gary Habermas, and when I was doing my religious research as a non-Christian, they readily admit the empty tomb by itself proves nothing. It doesn't prove a resurrection because there could have been a stolen body and stuff. Now, one thing I will say is I don't think just there is some nuance in that. Well, the fact that we can prove Jesus predicted his resurrection, within 3 days after he died and stuff like that, and then the fact that somebody stole the body, there would need to be a connection there. So I would need to posit somebody who wasn't one of the disciples, but had heard Jesus's predictions and apparently understood them when the 12 disciples didn't. So that's the only nuance I would say, is somebody who heard his predictions and had their own motivations stole the body. But that's an equally probable explanation to me. So yeah.
Well, couldn't the 12 disciples have said, Jesus was predicting his resurrection, let's get his body out of the grave?
I don't think so.
You don't think that they could have done that?
I think that's extremely improbable, given the fact of what happened afterwards, right? When they were willing to suffer and die for their.
I agree. It makes it less likely in that regard. But I just think like
as a
it's still better than, the body was just discarded, and it's better than almost any. I don't know. I see what you're saying, though, that then you have other problems, right? Then you have to say, well, this was a conspiracy, and they were willing to die for a lie, which doesn't seem likely. You know, people are willing to die for falsehoods, but they're not willing to die for lies. But
just for that reason, I would go with, look, maybe there was some kind of necromancer, as Dale Allison says, and he overheard Jesus giving his predictions, like, oh, okay, and then he found out he died, and he grabbed it like that. It just seems more likely somebody, or maybe another disciple outside of the main group or something. That makes more sense than one of the 12 stealing it.
Oh, I really want to quote Saruman to you and say, so what we have is a human necromancer. This is nothing, you know. we all know that got us into a lot of trouble when we follow that line of thinking.
Yeah. All right, cool. All right, well, yeah, that was great. Let's keep going with Paulogia number 4, mundane event number 4. So this Jesus had some followers while he was alive. Yep. But most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John.
Yeah, I mean, my response to this is, like I say in my video, there would have had to have been a community of believers that were still attesting to the resurrection around this time. I think it's safe to say that we don't know the names of the people in that community, but it had to have been more than Peter. And there's several reasons for that. Let's just take a step back here and talk about, I want to bring up again Sanhedrin Talmud 43a, because it actually does list off that there were 5 disciples of Jesus who were all killed, right? So now historians doubt that those specific names correspond to the actual disciples, but it's clear from that context that there would have been high penalties for believing in Jesus or for following Jesus, because this would have been promoting false idolatry. Now, it's important to note that this isn't just like, in the Old Testament, you shouldn't have like false idolatry, you shouldn't entice anyone to apostasy. This is the 9th commandment. This is one of the 10 commandments. Peter would have not, testified falsely unless he was extremely, extremely certain. It's also important to bring in Jewish tradition here, because there was a high degree of skepticism in Jewish tradition against witness testimony. I think I did an analysis of what are Jesus' most common phrases, and I can't remember if it's number 2 or number 3, but one of the most common things that Jesus says is no one can know the hour, right? That's a very, very common thing. A lot of people don't realize that's actually a direct quote which comes from the Jewish lunar calendar tradition. So every time the Jews reset their lunar calendar, they had a rigorous process for people have to see the moon, right? And you have to have at least 2 witnesses see the moon. And then you have to take those witnesses and you have to interrogate them rigorously and also separately, right? And this is just to reset the lunar calendar. So what that to me means is that Jewish skepticism was extremely high around witness testimony. And if you read Deuteronomy 19:15 and Deuteronomy 19:16, there are severe penalties for bearing false witness or for testifying falsely. If you testify, that person stole this from me, and you end up being wrong, or even if you have a vested interest. So first of all, if you have a vested interest, your testimony is thrown out, right? So if they had thought that Peter had any vested interest in testifying that Jesus had risen from the grave, people would have been like, well, you're a follower of Jesus, you've got a vested interest, and they would have thrown out his testimony automatically. If Peter was just like, came up to Jews and said, hey, I had an experience with the risen Jesus, I would think they would have at the very least said, where are your other witnesses? Because even to make a crime, you have to have like 2 or 3 witnesses to testify about any crime. And that's a mundane crime. To say like, I saw Jesus and he resurrected is a fantastical claim that first century Jews would have been very, very, very reluctant to accept this. So, and we're talking about a culture that had to interrogate 2 people separately just to reset the lunar calendar each month. So to me, it's very, very very unlikely that. This goes to like sort of my core overarching critique of the minimal witnesses model. In my video, some of the things I make are sort of line by line. This is false because this is false because of this. But some of my critiques were more overview. So this is one of my overview perspectives, that I think the overview presumption that Simon Peter was persuasive enough to convince anyone to believe in a very fantastical claim that was just refuted by their own, eyewitness testimony, where they saw Jesus was suffering on the cross. Like, I mean, this was a public death. I mean, it's just very hard to imagine that even with 2 or 3 very, very certain witnesses, that anyone, if you brought 2 or 3 witnesses to me, and you say, we saw Jesus. I think if I were in first century Judea, I was a first century Jew, I would say, wait a second. First of all, you guys are, you guys have to be interrogated separately. Second of all, you guys are all followers of Jesus, so you have a vested interest. I just think it's extraordinarily unlikely that a culture of Jews in first century Judea would have been like, yep, fine, that checks out. I believe you now. Like it's just, to me, that is the biggest single gap in this whole argument. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point too much more than that, but I think there is sort of this assumption when you talk to modern atheists that, well, these were ancient people, so they had no critical thinking skills. But I think that's flawed. The Jews were extremely shrewd. There's a lot of critical analysis that shows up in the Talmud. They were a society that was debating theology in a way that was very articulate, and moreover, they had enshrined in their 10 Commandments and ingrained in their theology and in their monthly practices to be extremely skeptical of witness testimony. So this would not have been a trivial thing. So I don't care how great an orator Peter was, he wouldn't have convinced anybody without a bunch of other witnesses in my mind.
Yeah, well said. So, okay, now before I go to a comparison with Gary's minimal facts, because this is, I think, somewhat relevant to that, but it is related to the very start with mundane event number 5. So I first want to let you respond to the facticity of number 5 here, where he says, distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him through a post-bereavement hallucinatory experience. So I know you go into great detail on this thing. So what's your take, first of all, and then we'll come back to the comparison with Gary's minimal facts.
Okay, excellent. All right, so psychiatric diagnoses have to line up with a lot of criteria. Now, post-bereavement hallucinations are not in the DSM-5, right? So they're not in the manual, but where we look at those criteria. So you can be a little bit more loose with how you apply them, but you can't just say like, okay, you've got joint pain, so you have lupus, right? I can't say you're having chest pain, so you're having a heart attack. We have to look at other evidence to make a medical diagnosis in general, right? So, and that's especially true for psychiatric conditions. So, if I say you're sad, therefore you have depression, that's just false, right? So, the same goes for post-bereavement hallucinations. So, does Peter have any criteria that align with post-bereavement hallucinations? Yeah, I mean, he was bereaved. And, and if you say, well, he had a hallucination, he was bereaved, so that should align with this. But unfortunately, many of the other things that we know about post-bereavement hallucinations were not present in this case. It's important to note that the literature around post-bereavement hallucinations is different than the literature around other hallucinatory experiences. For instance, there are not many olfactory hallucinations built into any other, hallucinatory condition. So in other words, post-bereavement hallucinations are the only hallucinatory condition that I'm aware of where olfactory hallucinations count as a hallucination. And this is a large portion of the hallucinations. If you have a subjective sense that the loved one is still with you in some sense, that, that their presence lingers in some way, that counts as a post-bereavement hallucination. This is not the experience that Peter had. Having a visual hallucination is not common. That's the minority of post-bereavement hallucinations. Having a waking visual hallucination is definitely very uncommon. Most of the hallucinations that people have are very brief glimpses, and they're almost always hypnagogic, so going to sleep, or hypnopompic, so waking up from sleep. Those are what those two words mean. So and I would encourage, don't test this out, actually. That's not good advice. But I mean, you can actually induce hallucinations through sleep deprivation. So a lot of these hallucinations are likely due to sadness, sleep deprivation. We know that depression induces sleep deprivation, and that can induce hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations. So if you're sleep deprived for over 48 hours, 90% of people have a brief hallucination, but you immediately sort of recognize that as a hallucination. I'll say during my postgraduate training, I went a long time without sleep, and I would sometimes have brief hypnagogic hallucinations, and it's almost as though you start dreaming and you're kind of still half awake and you're like, oh man, I gotta go to bed. So then, anyways, so that's more the criteria of post-bereavement hallucination. These are also overwhelmingly, the majority of these are in spousal interactions. They're almost all because, you know, you've been sleeping next to somebody for decades of your life. Every day, you know, every night you go to bed next to somebody, and then you turn around and they're not there, and your mind is sort of used to their presence, and so, you know, you see sort of a brief vision of them. So that's the most common setting. So to say that, you know, 30 to 60% of bereaved individuals are, you know, have a brief hallucinatory experience, you know, that's you know, that's because we're studying a population of mostly spousal bereaved groups, right? And moreover, as I say in my video, if you ever have a prevalence that's that widespread from 30 to 60%, it's because we're talking about different entities. So there's a lot of reasons why, you know, Peter's mistaken belief could not be a post-bereavement hallucination, or at least it doesn't meet the criteria. I think if your argument is, we know that post-bereavement hallucinations happen, and therefore we know that humans can have false ideas, and therefore there may have been some psychological factors that played into Peter's belief that Jesus had returned. I think that's a much more persuasive and medically sound argument, and it's much more scientific. If your argument is instead, we know about post-bereavement hallucinations, we know what the criteria are, and we know that Peter matches that, and that's the argument, and by the way, that's the argument that gets transmitted in a lot of these atheist debates, then that is flatly incorrect. That's just false. Peter, he was the wrong demographic. He only knew Jesus for 3 years. Post-bereavement hallucinations about a teacher never occur. Post-bereavement hallucinations about a friend are exceedingly uncommon. So I think you at least have to say that what Peter experienced would, if it is a post-bereavement hallucination indeed, it's an extremely uncommon, very atypical manifestation of this entity. And the problem is then you're making a diagnosis based on, you know, your assumption that this is a hallucination, which, you know, and that sort of already presupposes a theological belief going into the debate. And I think that's the only thing that you have to hang your hat on. And so it's not the depth of sadness, it's really the extent of exposure to the individual. So in other words, even if Peter was very, very sad about the passing of Jesus, that it's not the depth of your sadness that makes you have a post-bereavement hallucination. It's really the extent of your interaction. So if I sleep next to somebody for several years over and over and over again, then, you know, and they are then gone, I will wake up and sort of look over and sort of, as I'm waking up, see them. And that's by far the most common setting of post-bereavement hallucination. So I reviewed a lot of literature on this. There's other sort of medical things that are atypical about Peter's experience compared to post-bereavement hallucinations, but that's probably enough for now.
Okay, I do want to follow up. So you did mention, obviously, there is totally different entities. When we're talking about hallucinations, there are other types of hallucinations. So let's say that you are correct, and even Paulogia kind of realizes the error of his ways and says, yeah, what a fool I was. Forget about post-bereavement hallucinations, but maybe Peter had some other type of hallucination that was induced for whatever reason. Like, how do you think that hypothesis would fare in explaining Peter's resurrection experience?
You know, I mean, if you're saying, oh, vaguely, this could be other psychological factors, you know, there are sort of pseudo-theological beliefs that sort of emerge in situations of mass hysteria. We don't really understand those very well. So I think it's mistaken to say that that's what, you know, I'm actually a little surprised that Paulogia doesn't go into that a little bit more in the minimal witnesses model. I know he does mention that in some debates, but I think that's at least more persuasive than post-bereavement hallucinations. I don't think it counts for everything. I think the other point that you're getting at is, let's say that Peter had a hallucination, right? Yeah. Immediately after he had this hallucination, somebody would have been like, dude, Peter, get a hold of yourself. You can't talk about this. People are going to kill you if you talk about this publicly. And Peter would have been like, yeah, you're right. I'm bearing false witness. That's you know, I shouldn't testify about this. And number two, they would have said, if you testify about this, Peter, you're automatically going to like incur all the wrath that hit Jesus based on what we know from Sanhedrin Talmud 43a, which says that, you know, Jesus' other disciples were killed as well, you know. So even if you don't believe that his other disciples were killed, I think you have to take that as a serious warning that nobody should follow in the footsteps of Jesus, right? So, so Peter would have had to not only have a hallucination, but a fixed belief. And I think what you're getting at in that follow-up question is there's a difference between hallucinations and delusions. And we'll talk about that more when we get to Paul. But it is important to note that just having a hallucination does not induce a fixed false belief. So in other words, when I was very sleepy and I had my little hypnagogic hallucination and I went to bed afterwards, it was not, I didn't think it was about my brother. But anyways, I didn't have any delusions about my brother the next day. It wasn't like I was like, wow, he was really physically here. I literally saw him. It was a totally different, category. And I was like, so I don't think that that Peter would have committed his entire life based on a hallucinatory experience. I think even if you're very persuasive and if you're logical at all, really, if you have a hallucination, that's not going to convert into a delusion. A delusion is a totally different. It almost always relies on organic psychosis. We'll get into this a little bit more with Paul, so it's probably enough on that point. But I think that's what you're getting at in your follow-up question.
Yeah, fair enough.
And if I'm talking too much, feel free to cut me off.
No, this is great. Like I said, you've got a lot of knowledge. I want you to share that with my audience here. So, okay,
that's very flattering of you to say. This is based on a couple of years of scholarship, and many of your listeners are much more aware of a lot of this stuff than I am. But go on.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you with number 4, just the follow up before we go to the minimal facts comparison. So I noticed I kind of critiqued very briefly and vaguely, but this notion of Paulogia is that the main followers disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history. So it's almost like they just sort of disappeared, and Peter totally lost track and stuff. What do you think I know you kind of argued there has to be this community, but what is the likelihood that members of the 12, this core group, could just disappear en masse and leaving behind only Peter and possibly John?
Well, there's not, when I read the New Testament, I thought the role of the 12 would be more significant. It's not like they all like leave letters behind saying what they did with their lives and what their theology was. Writing was very uncommon. It's also probably true that there weren't 12 of them, and they were just referred to as the 12, right? We know that like sort of Judas, I think like after Judas's departure from the group, they were still referred to as the 12. Yeah. So presumably the 12 just meant these are the core of disciples. I know it's sort of 12 tribes of Israel, so there was probably like some parallel there. So, I think it's hard to say that there's a one-to-one correlation on the names that we have and what the fates are of those individuals. I know that you did make a pretty extensive argument that, we are quite certain that John at least stuck around, right? So I think the argument that we don't know the one-to-one fates of the disciples is quite persuasive. I think the argument that there was no community, that the 12 just dispersed, and that there was no one left but Peter holding the bag, is not very persuasive. I think you have to have a community experiencing that resurrection belief, and they have to be proclaiming it in a community. If it had just been one or two people, they probably would have been killed, and probably nobody would convince those one or two people to make their testimony public. It had to be at least more people than that. And I think that's a fairly well-established scholarly consensus as well. I go into my video quoting a bunch of scholars who say, yeah, there was probably at least a group of people who proclaimed. Whether or not it was the original 12 and who of those 12 stuck around, and whether or not there was some maybe transition of people in and out is very, very hard to say. But it is strange. It was strange to me reading the New Testament that you hear about the 12 and you get some of their names, but like, what happened to Nathaniel? What happened to these other people? But they don't have strong roles anywhere in the New Testament. So even before the death of Jesus, it's not like there's a lot of individual roles that they have. They don't each have an individual narrative arc. So I think maybe my expectation is based on what I expect from modern writing.
Yeah, fair enough. Awesome. Well, yeah. So in terms of my own assessment, again, getting back to Paulogia's goals for his minimal witnesses theory, Paulogia may be happy to fully agree with you. He's like, yeah, you pointed out the foolishness of my ways, of course. But look, I was never trying to argue that my hypothesis is probably true. I just wanted to say that it's possibly true, no matter how improbable. And in that case, it provides a possible account. These mundane events account for the minimal facts. And even with this very narrow goal, this is the first area where I said like Paulogia sucks. He's utterly failed. Look, but even if we narrow down the disciples, this is Gary's minimal fact. So the disciples, by which he just means Peter and John, that's all that we can prove according to Gary's minimal facts. Afterwards reported experiences, plural, that they thought were actually appearances of the risen Jesus. Paulogia's theory only gives a resurrection appearance experience to Simon Peter. So it's a failure. It doesn't account for minimal fact number two. I could literally do better even if I just said, okay, Simon Peter and John had post-bereavement hallucinations. Regardless of all the problems there, at least I would be possibly accounting for this minimal fact. So what do you make of the fact that, and same with number four, the minimal fact number three presupposes experiences, plural, presumably of at least Peter and John, and this accounted for their lives being thoroughly transformed, whereas this doesn't seem to jive with Paulogia's minimal mundane event number four. So I said, even in terms of providing a possible account, I think Paulogia's theory fails, even as a possible account. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think, again, I could come up with probably something that is extremely unlikely, but would do a better job of covering the minimal facts. So, I mean, I could put together two things that happened. So I would say, number one, the body of Jesus was stolen, right? And then I would say number two, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous to some listeners, but that's kind of the very point. But number two, Jesus pulled like an Alfred Borden from The Prestige, and there was like a secret twin. So after Jesus died, that secret twin took the place of Jesus, maybe stole the body. And I know some Christians have actually, or some fringe theorists, some conspiracy theorists have actually argued that there was maybe a twin. But to me, that's at least it's exceedingly unlikely. And you're not going to write a book saying that Jesus had a secret twin who then came out after Jesus was killed, and made a bunch of appearances. So you're not going to have that argument be made by anyone in a scholarly medical journal or a scholarly academic publication of any sort. But my point.
Sorry to just one quick thing, and then I'll let you continue. But
sure.
It's not even that. Oh, we can come up with a better account. This is not an account at all, because he's only positing Simon Peter. In order to be an account, even if it's the worst account, you have to account for Peter and John. The disciples had experiences. Under his theory, the disciples, Peter and John, didn't have experiences. Only Peter did. So it's not even an account at all, let alone the worst account. But yeah, continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. You can explain Peter. I kind of do say that in the video, but I kind of gloss over. But the fact that even if you buy post-bereavement hallucinations, you can explain Peter and Peter only. Post-bereavement hallucinations are by definition always solitary experiences. There's never been a post-bereavement hallucination that's occurred for more than one person at a time anywhere in the literature. So I agree with what you're saying, that it doesn't explain John. It wouldn't explain any other individuals. So I sort of make that point, but I do make that point kind of briefly in my video. But the overarching point is this, that even if you accept everything that Paulogia is saying and saying, like, look, this is extremely tenuous, but it does explain to me Christian theology, if not the line-by-line facts that are delineated by Dr. Habermas, you're still accepting something that's exceedingly unlikely. And this is what I say in my video, is that, is a miracle an event that is exceedingly unlikely? Or is it something that has to violate the laws of nature? Like, I could buy that there were miraculous visionary experiences that multiple people experienced. As as a scientist, as an academician, that is a more persuasive explanation to me. But then you have to get to the point where you're like, it would really take a miracle for a bunch of people all at once to have a visionary experience that they all agreed on, that they all corroborated, at least with each other. I think witnessing individual experiences alone would not have been adequate for first century Jews, So you have to really have a joint experience. I don't go into this in a super huge amount of depth, but, let's say you're saying, well, still a visionary experience appearing to multiple people all having the same hallucination at the same time, that is still exceedingly unlikely, but it's still more likely than somebody rising from the grave. then you're still buying a hypothesized explanation that's exceedingly unlikely. And as I say in my video, that at that point it sort of becomes indistinguishable from providence. And so my point is, if you define a miracle as something that has to violate the laws of nature, that cannot happen, that has a 0% chance likelihood of happening, then you can have any kind of wild, crazy conspiracy. Jesus was an alien, Jesus was a time traveler, and it becomes massively more likely than the infinitesimal probability of 0% of a miracle. But I think to me, as a theological neophyte, if I'm theological at all, it's much more persuasive to say, okay, these were visionary experiences, and there were a bunch of visionary experiences, and all these people had hallucinations and delusions together. That is still so exceedingly unlikely that it becomes persuasive as a miraculous event in and of itself, just because it happened to this one person, Jesus, in the exact right time and setting for this belief system to emerge after his death, exactly in the way he predicted, and exactly in the context of this person who had a very powerful, very committed, devoted following. So I guess my point is that, there's sort of line-by-line problems. It's very hard to explain group appearances. As you said, having like a group belief in a resurrected Jesus is very, very difficult to explain, especially in the setting of first century Judea. And I realize that that Paulogia doesn't really define that. I wouldn't categorize him, as you say, as an utter failure. I think it falls short. But yeah, I wouldn't say he's like Paulogia is extremely much more brilliant, much more articulate than I am, and much more well versed in theology than I am. But having said that, I agree with what you're saying, that he doesn't really explain multiple people having a visionary experience, and they really, really, I think personally, have to have a visionary experience together for it to be at all palatable to any of them. All right, go on.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and just out of when I use the word utter failure kind of thing, what I'm saying by that is, look, you had a very easy target, right? Just to provide that possible account. Paulogia says here, the possibilities are endless, kind of thing. There's so many ways he could have accounted for Peter and John, just Peter and John having that resurrection experience, whatever that was, kind of thing. But yet he doesn't connect the dots. He only accounts for half of that. So that's all I meant there by, it is sort of an utter failure, because it would have been so easy to just connect the dots and posit anything else for John, and then you would have done the deed and succeeded, kind of thing. But
yeah, and moreover, even if you have Peter and John, even if you have an explanation for both of them, I think there's still nobody would have believed that with just two witnesses.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, here, enter in another failure for Paulogia here. So mundane event number 6. And you can call it what you want. But so James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of his disciples named John. So we kind of covered John already above, but focusing now on James, the brother of Jesus. So we have that's your video. We have this minimal fact from Gary Habermas. And of course, it's taking its time.
Oh, okay, what happened?
So, what?
Oh, what would happen? Sorry, I think.
Oh, for some reason, it's just okay. Well, forget it. So, James, the brother of Jesus. This is one of Gary's minimal facts, that he had an experience that he believed was a resurrection appearance. Now, here, Paulogia is trying to account for James, but he's not accounting for the minimal fact, even possibly, because he's denying James had an experience, whether it was a hallucination, illusion, whatever it was. Instead, he was only persuaded by Peter's testimony. So I chalk that up as another failure, even on the level of just providing a possible account, because again, it's denying the minimal fact, and a denial of a fact is not an account for a fact, right? Otherwise, you might just say, like, Jesus mythicism denies all the facts, so therefore it can account for the 6 minimal facts. That doesn't make sense. So, like, yeah, in the first place, in terms of Paulogia's goal, that just providing a possible account, do you think this theory provides that for James, for the minimal fact that James had an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this point on the article just kind of trails off a little bit, because at the end he says, or maybe James just took over the family business. The possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's, even Bart Ehrman makes the case that we know that James had a fundamental theological transition. So I don't think that's adequately explained by just Peter telling him, no, it really was Jesus. Like, I think James would have been like, whatever. Like, I could see maybe if Peter had a bunch of other witnesses who all said, look, James, we all saw Jesus, but then you have to have multiple witnesses, and that kind of violates the first part of the minimal witness model. So I think if you're relying on that, then you're putting the cart before the horse. I think, I agree with the historical consensus that James had some fundamental theological shift, and we seem to be very certain of that. I have a quote from Bart Ehrman about James's transition in one of my videos, but I do think it kind of trails off. Maybe just James just took over the family business. The possibilities are endless. Well, they're not really endless. You have to come up with an explanation. You can't just say that, James was I think arguing that James was influenced by Peter and that alone shifted James fundamentally is, again, extremely likely, particularly given the context of first century Judea.
Awesome. All right, cool. And I'm just kind of curious, do you agree with my principle that like there seems to be confusion with a lot of Paulogia's fans, whereby they almost think that the denial of a minimal fact is an account for the minimal fact. Am I crazy there or something? Like, I don't think the denial of a fact is an account for it. You're basically saying there is no fact to account for in the begin with, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So, it kind of depends on how you're using minimal witnesses argument. I think it shows up in two ways. I think it shows up in some debate context very narrowly, and in other contexts more broadly. So when it shows up narrowly as a direct one-to-one refutation of Dr. Habermas's, I think it's more persuasive in that context. But admittedly, it doesn't really resolve this issue with James, as you're saying, and as you're correctly pointing out. But I think if you make it in my video, I kind of tend to take the whole debate more broadly as like, is this something that really explains away Christianity in a way that's convincing? Does it explain the events in first century Judea as, in terms of the narrative of Jesus' death and the early spread of the nascent movement of proto-Christianity, as Paulogia calls it? And my argument is it doesn't really explain that. I think you're making an additional argument, which is that it also, like you're saying, it denies that Dr. Habermas's fact is applicable or appropriate or should be put in this context without really explaining how it sort of meets that fact. It doesn't meet the burden of the criteria. It just says, yeah. I think you explain this really well in your, like, around the 40-minute mark of your first video of the response part 1.
Yeah, Paulogia part 1. All right, cool. Now, I do have one question on the substantive matter about the truth of this, because you have mentioned for a few of these people, and I think it's appropriate to bring it up now, this notion of, look, even if, let's say, Paulogia's thing happened, Peter had his whatever it was, and he believed Jesus rose from the dead, and now he's talking to James and John, and somehow he's persuading these people. But you've mentioned how unlikely that is within this first century Jewish context. And I've made that argument based on argumentation from Jake O'Connell, whereby the nature of the appearance, or whatever it was, this experience whereby Jesus is appearing in a mundane form. He's not what the Jews expected. The resurrection would be a glorious body, some ancient Jewish sources, he was shining or dressed in white, something like that. They envisioned a glorious resurrection body. And they're not seeing that. Peter didn't see that, and none of James and John, even though this is the first century Jewish expectation of what a resurrected body would entail. So I've kind of argued on that basis that it's very unlikely that they had hallucinations, or in this case, that it just supports how unlikely it would be that Peter would be able to persuade them. Instead, if Peter had a hallucination by himself, they would convince him, you're wrong. You mean you just saw Jesus with holes in his hand here on earth, and he wasn't wearing white, he wasn't up in the sky with angels around him, and he wasn't in a glorious body? And then Peter would say, oh yeah, you're right. I don't know. I was dreaming. Something happened. Yeah, you're right. I didn't see him. I'm crazy. Like, I'm just saying, in terms of the social dynamics and the first century Jewish context, wouldn't it would be much more likely they would persuade Peter out of his delusion rather than him get them to join in. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I mean, they would have said, Peter, for your own safety, you can't tell anybody about this. And if I were Peter's friend, I would have, if he was refractory, I would have spirited him away. I would just said, let's get you out of danger. You know, let's get you out of Jerusalem. And if you want to go to like Assyria or some other place and talk about Jesus resurrecting, like that's a better strategy. I definitely wouldn't have been like, let's hang out in Jerusalem and proclaim this belief that somebody just got killed for proclaiming, or for somebody just got killed for apostasy anyways, and let's all proclaim the same thing. And I mean, they were clearly facing some danger, yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, now we come to number 7. So basically, stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. And he specifies Peter was not personally present to confirm or correct these adopted, I think he means adapted narratives, or yeah. So what's your take on this? Because I don't think this is per se related to a minimal fact. It might be semi-related to. Gary has a fact that he says very early on, but he means attached to Peter in the earliest Jerusalem church. There were the gospel message and resurrection was being preached and stuff. But I think here Paulogia more has in mind gospel stories. But I just want to turn it to you. Like, what's your take on number 7 here?
Yeah, so in my video, I talk about there's actually several pre-Pauline gospels, and I know that people debate what that means, if that means like within the first year, within the first 3 years, within the first 5 years. I don't think it matters that much to me. The point is that the Jews were so first of all, the Jews were pretty good at transmitting and conserving information through through oral tradition. So we don't have that skill set anymore because we don't need to have it. But in first century Judea, this would have been a very practiced skill set. We also know that a lot of the statements about Jesus that were pre-Pauline, and I have the full list in my video. I don't remember them all. But a lot of these statements were written in ways that are mnemonic, right? They were rhyming and metered schemes, similar to like the Sermon on the Mount was used a lot of alliteration, so that there were points that would be memorable that people could repeat to each other. So there are definitely ways that the Jews were good at conserving oral testimony. So now there is sort of an implicit motivation here in that people wanted to start embellishing or inventing new details. Now, I think the problem is it doesn't say what's the motivation of those people. In other words, you could maybe argue that like Peter might have wanted to carry on the tradition, but why were the details embellished by other people? And if Peter had embellished the details, he would have immediately lost some of the core group, who would have said, well, that's not true at all. So, I think this sort of ignores the way that oral tradition can meaningfully conserve information and hand down information over. Often throughout histories, we have examples of oral traditions conserving information for millennia or centuries. So the gap that would have had to have been bridged in this setting probably would have not been longer than 40 years at most, even under very liberal interpretations. And I think that's long enough to keep an oral creed sustained. For instance, if you wiped out all music, starting with 40 years ago, going backwards, would we be able to reconstruct that music? Yeah, I mean, I could write down lyrics to about 1,000 different songs right now. Just maybe that's an exaggeration, but at least hundreds of songs on my own, and they'd be pretty good. So that's one aspect of my rebuttal to this. The second aspect of my rebuttal to this is that there has to be sort of some motivation for really virally spreading these stories, and I don't see that motivation showing up yet. Maybe it shows up for Peter a little bit, but again, there's why were they embellishing details? Why did they have all these theological goals? Why did they want to recruit new followers? There's no evidence that they were getting any rewards for doing any of this stuff. Now, sometimes we see in modern times, we see like religions starting up from nothing. And then we see examples of evangelism, but there's almost always maybe the best example of that is cargo cults. I know Richard Carey talks a lot about cargo cults, and I hate to give him so many quotes in this presentation, but let's look at that as a counterpoint, right? Well, cargo cults, the gaps between the indigenous population and the population that was bringing in that technology was about 15 centuries, so about 1,500 years. That's the technological gap. That's what we, sort of say is the gap. So you had people who were confronted with something that was outside of their range of experience by about 15 centuries, right? So, and that's why people started like having theological beliefs around these cargo cults. So then you're back to the, having a problem here that you need to solve. So if you're saying this was theological embellishment, just like other religious traditions grow, you still have to have an incitement for that to grow. So in other words, what is the equivalent that the initial seed of the nascent Christian movement had that was the equivalent of being exposed to technology that's from 15 centuries in the future? I don't think we have that. And so again, I think you're presuming a motivation for spreading a theology when there would have been no reward for doing that, and you're just putting more people at risk for doing that. So I don't see this as it's certainly, I don't see the causation here well enough sussed out.
Fair enough. Yeah. Like I said, I think this is just tangentially relevant to the minimal facts kind of thing, right? So yeah,
that's a good point too. Yeah.
Okay, so number 8. So this one, Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus. And just before I go over to you to get your take, because you had a great take in your video on this, just in terms of assessing it from Paulogia's goal or the minimal witness's goal, I think this gets a green check mark. This does provide a possible, regardless of how unlikely it is a possible account for the minimal fact. I wish I could show you the minimal fact, but my thing's lagging on YouTube. But Gary gives, the appearance to Paul is one of his minimal facts, and this is providing an account for it. He had a non-veridical vision. So a green check mark to Paulogia for that narrow goal. But I want to turn it over to you, Tavo, for the more broad goal. If we're looking at the truth, what is actually probably true, or the most probable true hypothesis, how does this mundane event account for the fact of Paul's resurrection appearance experience?
Yeah, so there's 2 questions that we have here, and I sort of delineate this more specifically in my own video. But question number 1, did Paul have, question number 1 is really, can you have a delusion that comes from an acute stressor like this? And question number 2 is, can that delusion explain Paul's theology? And I don't think either one really lines up. You can have acute stress, and that can create a psychotic break. That can happen. Almost always there is some underlying psychosis, or underlying at least proto-psychosis, to borrow the language that Paul uses. It's almost never chronic guilt. I couldn't find any cases of this. Now, this does show up as a trope in a lot of movies, like it's in The Black Swan, The Machinist, Shutter Island. So I reference all these movies in my video. But in actual psychological and psychiatric clinical experience, this is not something that's commonly seen. So in other words, we don't have somebody who lives with a lot of guilt, and then all of a sudden they have a psychotic break because they're living with so much guilt. Almost always when you have a psychotic break, it's an acute stressor. So what we're talking about is you're living with your family, you have some underlying schizophrenia that's probably like oligosymptomatic, right? So you don't have that many symptoms around it. And then your family kicks you out, and then you're homeless, and then you're sleep deprived, and then you're much more radically under-resourced. And therefore you have your really frank psychotic break where they pick you up and you're just, completely delusional, and you've gone totally off the rails. And again, I probably shouldn't use much more tempered language, because I don't want to be pejorating any psychological illness. But the point is this, that this is not, chronic guilt does not lead to a single psychotic break the way we'd expect with Paul. And then the other point is this: almost never do we see like a significant theological shift from a single delusionary episode. So, for instance, we have people who are bipolar who sometimes have delusions, and they'll sort of have a specific delusion, right? And then immediately when their manic episode is resolved, they can look back on that episode. Not always, but in almost all cases, they can look back on that episode and say, yeah, I believed this because I was bipolar, because I was manic. Now that I'm not manic anymore, I don't believe that anymore. So it's not like Paul would have taken that acute delusional episode and say, okay, this is now the new reality for me. Now, there are many other problems which I get into my video, and I get into in a little bit greater detail, and people can research this on your own. But for instance, one of the other significant problems is almost always if you have a delusion, it's congruent with your pre-existing belief system. So in other words, it's unlikely that Paul would have had a delusion that countered everything that Paul had learned. Paul rose to a very high degree of notoriety, a very high degree of respect. If you read the Toledot Yeshu about Jesus, it uses very exculpatory language towards Paul. So there is this sense that Paul was still among the Jews very reasonably respected. So he must have had a fairly high rank. And in fact, a lot of versions of the Toledot Yeshu have Paul working as a double agent, saying that Paul never actually believed Jesus, that this was all like Paul's subterfuge. But the point is this, that it's very, very uncommon for a psychotic episode to also bring about this kind of sea change in your own internal theological beliefs. Moreover, if Paul had a non-veridical vision of Jesus, and then he went to Peter, and Peter had an additional experience with Peter, I think Paul, as a seasoned Jew, as Saul of Tarsus, would have said, wait a second, this still amounts to two different people with two different beliefs that no one else will attest to. And I think Paul would not have gone anywhere with this. I think Paul would have said, look, I had a vision, I had an experience, but it's just me. I'm a single witness that doesn't, I think most people would. For instance, if Jesus came to me in a vision and said, you have to do something that theologically I wouldn't normally do, you have to kill somebody, I'd be like, okay, I immediately can tell that I'm having a psychotic break here, that I'm not so I think Paul would have at least admitted that he himself as a single witness would not have been enough to create a new theological system. I think maybe you could argue that if he had a very convincing vision and then he interacted with a bunch of Christians who gave him or proto-Christians anyways, who gave him a bunch of congruent analysis, that he would have been more persuaded to take his message to others. But again, I think you have several gaps in the causality here. Now, like you're saying, this does explain it. It's just exceedingly unlikely. So yes, Paul could have had a very, very atypical psychotic break. Yes, he could have had a very, very atypical manifestation of a brief delusional disorder that persisted throughout his life. And, maybe he was indeed schizophrenic, and he just was one of the very, very few people with schizophrenia who is extremely persuasive, even though he has schizophrenia, who maintained a very high level of cognitive function throughout his life. That also doesn't really make a lot of sense for a lot of other reasons. But, again, this is all extraordinarily unlikely. So you have to have very, very atypical definitions of schizophrenia, very, very atypical definitions of delusional disorders, very, very atypical definitions of what Paulogia cites, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think you're aligning a lot of things that is, maybe it's possible, but if it is, it's extraordinarily unlikely. And I think you at least have to be sort of intellectually honest and admit that there are gaps in your causality and at least gaps in your probability, certainly.
Yeah, it's implausible too, as well, right? It's not just improbable, it's implausible, even if possible. So,
yeah.
You don't want to commit that it's possible, therefore it is fallacy, right? So, okay.
Exactly.
Just before we go on to number 9, let me just ask you, because I've been sharing my screen this whole time, so I haven't been able to see the chat. Have there been a lot of questions? I don't know if you've seen in the comments.
That's a good question. Let me go to the comment section. Let's.
Questions?
Wait, it may give me some feedback. Hopefully it's not. Okay, now I see.
If you see a lot of questions with a Q, then I might need to switch something up. But if there's not, then we can just continue.
Question. If Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple, as the Gospels claim, don't you think he would be risking a lot by outing himself as a disciples when placing the body of Jesus in his own tomb? Let me mute that. Okay, so all right. So did you get that question?
Yeah, yeah. If there's, yeah, so that's the only one, right? Or,
Yeah, yeah.
okay,
There's actually more questions. Yeah.
okay. So yeah, I tell you, go ahead and answer that question. But all I was going to say is when we continue on with number 9, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll go through the questions and star them for the end, kind of thing. So, but yeah, go ahead and answer the question you read out first.
It's an interesting hypothesis. If so, the question is, if Joseph of Arimathea was essentially, if he was saying, here, Jesus, you can use my family's tomb, wouldn't he have run the risk of incurring the wrath against Jesus at that time? So I think the argument is, number one, it doesn't really matter that much, because for my own personal theology, I don't know that I need a specific Joseph of Arimathea. Number two, it's likely that because of his high position, he would have been able to sidestep that. Number three, in the disciple in the Jewish tradition, Joseph of Arimathea would have been being very helpful. If you read the book of Tobit, it's about providing a grave for somebody else, essentially, is the moral of the story. So Joseph of Arimathea would have been doing a good deed by keeping Jesus out of the ground. Keep in mind that keeping Jesus, by putting Jesus into a burial place and keeping Jesus out of like his body polluting the ground is what I'm trying to say. So keep in mind that Jewish tradition is not based on honoring the people who are criminals who are killed. That the key of Jewish tradition is you're polluting the ground, you're creating an impurity in the earth itself by not following proper burial practices. So it's likely that the Sanhedrin would have still seen this act on Joseph of Arimathea's part as a good deed. This is a question from modern atheism, and modern atheism has asked a few other questions. I don't see any other questions from other individuals other than modern atheism, but
Okay, and it's just a few, or
yeah, but we could do a couple more from
sure.
yeah. Are you familiar with Dale Allison's work on group hallucinations? He provides several alleged examples on his book on the resurrection, like multiple people who claim to see a ghost in a group. No, I don't know a lot about group hallucinations. But do you want to answer that, Dale? Feel free to. This is about a question about Dale Allison's work on group hallucinations.
Okay, so this was the first question you got answered with if Joseph of Arimathea, right?
Yeah. And there's other questions, all from modern atheism.
Okay, so is this the one he was asking? What about Kermanisky's claim that bodies? Okay, so that's the same thing. Somebody throw a pie already. So this is the question. Are you familiar with Dale Allison's work on group hallucinations? He provides several alleged examples on his book on the resurrection, like multiple people who claim to see a ghost in a group. So yeah, one thing I would say on that, even if we assume it's true, like for example, ghosts are a paranormal or supernatural experience, so far as we know. It's not a part of our ordinary naturalistic thing. So even if I grant this, like it's easily explainable. Oh yeah, they were seeing a demon masquerading as a ghost or something like this. So this isn't really problematic for Jesus's resurrection. And I think it actually serves to show the case for the miraculousness of the resurrection group appearances. Because what I argue is that these type of group appearances only take place for paranormal or within extraordinary contexts. So ghosts or demons or aliens or something that's not a part of our well-established, currently well-known natural world and stuff like that. So if this appearance of the ghost wasn't something actually supernatural, well then why aren't there group appearances of people seeing Tom Cruise just going going for a meet and greet or something like that, when we can prove actually he was in Hollywood? Like there aren't these mass hallucinations that take place within an ordinary context. At least the provable ones always seem to involve something supernatural, like a ghost, where we can say, yeah, it's they were actually seeing something. It was an objective thing that their eyeballs were seeing there. So That's how I would, even granting everything about Dale Allison's case for the sake of argument, I think it actually further supports the case for the group appearances not being a mass hallucination, but instead this group is actually seeing something there, whether a ghost or a demon or whatever it is. Does that make sense, Tavo?
Yeah, I like that as an explanation. Obviously, there's other parallels that are significant. Like, no one ever had to face death for claiming that they saw a ghost, you know? And then a lot of ghost appearances are extremely on the fringes of hallucination. So I wouldn't say it's like I actually saw. It's not like you see a ghost like floating as a disembodied phantasm with nearly corporeal form, like in Ghostbusters, right? Where they talk about like full thoracic vapor, you know, full thoracic vaporous manifestation. Sorry, I saw Ghostbusters recently. It's not, that's not what happens. Usually what it is you hear a creak, you look and there's a shadow. And so it's, I would say it's sort of on the fringe of a true sensory hallucination.
All right, cool. Now this one's a bit, okay, so with Eyes Wide Shut is saying people can be wrong. How can you know better if you're always right? And I don't know what DGD means. I'm not up to date with the lingo. But DGD, if you claim to have a book inspired by an all-knowing God and it's wrong, you know most people are retarded, so why believe? Yeah, I'm not sure if that's really related to your presentation, but I guess it's yeah, like I guess relating it to Paulogia, he's just arguing for possibility, right? That's his proper thing. So like, I guess he could say, why should we ever believe when it's possible we're wrong? Wouldn't it be safer to just say I don't know or something? That's me trying to spin it into something relevant for you. But yeah, what's your take on that? Is it rational? If there is this possibility, shouldn't we always be agnostic and never decide for one hypothesis over another?
Yeah, I mean, I know DGD can stand for a few different things, so I'm trying to see what they're. I'm kind of more curious with the lingo.
Okay.
Don't get discouraged, maybe.
Okay.
Doesn't really make sense in that context. Anyways, yeah, I mean, I think like I feel like I'd be remiss if I object to the statement. Most people are R word. I just feel like I should probably say that I don't know that I would take that as my presumption, starting with theological systems. But I mean, I think skepticism is healthy. In other words, there are things I don't believe. I mean, and we can maybe talk about this in another conversation. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I don't believe in a book that's totally infallible. I mean, there are certainly things in the Old Testament that I find to be very problematic. There are some things that I think in the New Testament that I think are problematic, depending on the context that you take them in. But I don't know that I believe in the verbal and plenary inspiration school of thought, which believes that an all-knowing God wrote everything and the Bible is completely infallible. And I think, moreover, once you say, here's a book, it's got thousands of words and it's infallible, you run the risk of I think it's a highly tenuous argument to make. So I would argue that with Eyes Wide Shut makes an important point there, which is that we should be highly skeptical. I think, to me, there's sort of a minimal facts about Jesus that I believe that's sort of different than what Dr. Habermas believes. I'm happy to just maybe briefly touch on that at the end of the video, but I think it's like the question is, what is the core narrative to me? And that's sort of a more persuasive argument. If you take the whole book and say, what about these two lines that are off? Then I think that's more persuasive. And by the way, one more thing that I'll say about this quote, which is kind of nice. Most people are R words, so why believe? I think that makes a really persuasive point. Somebody once asked Tim Keller, who's a really interesting pastor, what is the most persuasive argument for atheism? And he said it's other Christians who really behave in ways that are very immoral. So I think it's reasonable to say, yeah, there are behaviors of the Christian populace in general that are very problematic, that make it very hard to follow the theology that they follow. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. So I think that's a very, very persuasive point. And maybe that's a topic for another video as well. I don't want to get too sidetracked.
Yeah, no problem. And I'll just contribute my own quick answer to this as well, because I think if this guy might be a skeptic, and I think he's trying to say maybe, like Gary Habermas and resurrection scholars, they tend to be Christians, and even biblical inerrantists and stuff like that. So like, if you've already got the right conclusion, how could you be fair in assessing the evidence? Maybe that's a part of this question. And on that front, I don't think it matters what your bias is, what your worldview is. There are ways to mitigate against that. And so long as you're being systematic, using the rules of logic and critical thinking properly, then you can mitigate against your biases and get to the truth. It doesn't matter which side you're on. Even if I really believe that Christianity, that Jesus rose from the dead, obviously I believe that now. So let's say I reevaluate the resurrection, but I'm doing so as a Christian, whereas during my religious research before, I was an unbeliever. I was just a theist. I don't think my bias matters. I'm able to be, and I can actually prove this, that I'm able to assess the warrant produced by the evidence itself and make a judgment. So one thing that's surprising for me is when I came to belief in the resurrection, it was only on the basis of one fact, really. Even though I believe we can establish the fact of the empty tomb, that Paul had an appearance, that James had an appearance, even the 500, I think, is probably a fact, despite it only being mentioned in that one source in the creed. But there's only one fact that on an explanatory level makes a difference and convinces me this is a miracle. So the tomb can be explained naturally. There's an equally probable natural explanation for that. Same with Paul, same with James, kind of thing. It's only the appearance to the 12, whereby the majority of that group had to experience something. That's where I go, we need a miracle to explain this. But even now as a Christian, just because I'm a Christian and I believe that all of the appearances were miraculous resurrections, I'm still able to evaluate the evidence for what it is and say, well, we can't actually prove that Paul's experience was miraculous. I believe that because the Bible says so. And I think that makes the most sense in light of knowing Christianity is true. But I wouldn't say if we took that independently, like the empty tomb, we can't prove independently that, yeah, the only way to explain an empty tomb is that Jesus rose from the dead or something like that. So I think it is possible to evaluate the evidence objectively, or at least as objectively as is possible, regardless of your worldview. So yeah, that's my take on that.
And two other follow-ups. Number one, if you could put what DGD means in the chat, if anyone knows what that means, that'd be super helpful. And then also feel free to explain what 6-7 means.
6-7.
Yeah, the 6-7 mean?
I have no idea, no.
Okay, if somebody could explain that, that'd be great.
All right, so let me go back to Paulogia's theory, and if you could keep an eye on the chat for me every once in a while. But
sure, for sure, yeah.
All right, so we are on mundane event number 9. So according to Paulogia, Paul met Peter and John in brackets, so I guess and possibly John, but they didn't see eye to eye. They disagreed with each other. So yeah, again, this doesn't correlate to a minimal fact. Really, it is background evidence for some of Gary's minimal facts. Like obviously, we're relying on Paul's testimony and stuff, but so it's background knowledge from a minimal facts perspective, but it doesn't correspond to any particular minimal fact. So I'll just turn it over to you, Tavo. Like, what is your take in terms of the general truth of this mundane event?
Yeah, I mean, in the interest of brevity, we can kind of skip over this, but I'll just be really brief and say that when Paul says the apostles added nothing, he's not speaking in general. He's sort of contextually, I think in Galatians, which is what Paul ends, Paulogia is citing. When Paul talks about this, he's talking about specifically circumcision practices. So I think it may be a more narrow statement when Paul says the Gospels added nothing to me, the disciples meant the apostles didn't add anything to my understanding. I don't think he's saying broadly, because he does say elsewhere in the book of Galatians that spreading the gospel messages, spreading the message that he got from Jerusalem was important to him, spreading an understanding of Jesus' theology more broadly than just what was limited to his own theological experience. So, but I think if anything, though, if Paul and Peter and John are not seeing eye to eye, then that makes Paul more skeptical to transmit the beliefs of Peter, and makes Paul probably more skeptical about the appearances that Jesus had towards Peter.
Okay. Okay. So I might not have been understanding you, but just out of curiosity to clarify. So are you agreeing with someone like Bart Ehrman that when Paul met with them in Jerusalem, he was just there to talk about his Gentile mission with the no circumcision? Or do you think, as Gary argues, I think evidently rightly, that it's implied he's also talking about the resurrection and hearing from them? Because we know from elsewhere, Paul considers the resurrection a part of the gospel message itself. So he's there to confirm his gospel, not just circumcision. He wants to, it just, number one, makes common sense, but it also helps us interpret, well, how the heck did Paul hear about the Last Supper and what Jesus said at the Last Supper? Well, it's because he was asking about the resurrection when he was there. Like, do you think there's any merit to that? Or do you think, no, we just have to go by the Bart Ehrman strict interpretation of he was just there to ask about circumcision?
I'm just sort of contextualizing when Paul says that the apostles added nothing to his message. I think he's speaking more narrowly. I don't think he's saying broadly they didn't add anything to his message. In other words, I think there were other ways in which Peter influenced the theology of, there was probably some, I think Paul at least learned things when he went and saw the rest of the nascent early Christian or proto-Christian, as Paulogia says, community.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Perfect. Yeah. All right, thank you. All right, so number 10, several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting the circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives. So this is definitely about the Gospels and that sort of thing, and possibly Acts. But yeah, what's your take on this fact?
I've completed sort of a statistical analysis about, I think I looked at about 200 to 300 works from antiquity, including the Gospels, the authentic letters of Paul, and lots of other works. And I looked at authorship attestation patterns. Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, and I hope this gets transmitted to Dr. Habermas, because this was really interesting research that I did. This is not anywhere in the literature. It's just in one of my YouTube videos. But again, I make a pretty solid case that it's erroneous, or at least very incomplete to the point of untruthful, to refer to the Gospels as anonymous works. Now, in antiquity, the pattern was with authorship is that you had a scroll, you wrapped up that scroll, and then it was wrapped with a ribbon around it, and that ribbon was called it's the Greek word for syllabus in Koine Greek. So and that's where the authorship information was. It wasn't on the scroll itself. It was on this attached fabric. Now, if we look at attestation patterns for all literature from antiquity, we have sort of gaps between first, second, and third authorship attestations. So what I did in my research is I looked at what that gap is. About 73% of all works from antiquity don't have internal authorship documented. So we would not have looked at the Gospels and expected them to individually, internally identify their authors within the documents themselves. That's a very slim minority of all works from antiquity. Okay, so saying that the Gospels are internally anonymous is a bit misleading, because all works were, well, not all works, but about 3/4 of works from that epoch were internally anonymous. And it's also important to note that what we know about authorship happens from other people attesting to what the authorship was of a work long after that work has been written. So that's where we know about most of the authorships. This is across Christian and secular works, all works from antiquity. So I guess my point is this. If you refer to the Gospels as anonymous, you essentially have to throw out much of what we know about authorship. I think it's much more appropriate to say that there were attestations from the Gospels. They actually occur much earlier than attestation patterns in all the other literature from antiquity. And again, there's statistically significant differences in that. Moreover, if you go from primary to secondary attestations, those secondary attestations happen earlier, and they're much more robust. And again, these are quantitative, statistically significant assertions that I'm making, and this is based on looking at a lot of data on this. So I would encourage people to look at my video. I did a whole video about this. To my knowledge, this is the only statistical analysis looking at authorship patterns and anonymity from ancient works. So that's one thing. And broadly philosophically, I guess I can add that some of the other stuff that we've said throughout this video still applies to this objection. In other words, it was decades later. This is a fairly short gap, I think, in the face of the strength of Jewish oral tradition. And also we know that there were creedal-based beliefs that were written into metered and mnemonic creeds that likely would have been able to sustain a gap of 40 years or so. I mean, I still remember songs that from 40 years ago because, I sing them again, and then I think this sort of overstates this gap of 40 years. I don't.
What I would say, if you don't mind, if you're able to find that link to the video, put it in the chat for people, or send it to me in the private chat, and I can post it up.
Oh no, I'll put it in the chat. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
I'd love for Dr. Habermas to take a look at that video at some point. I'd be over the moon to.
I'll definitely send it to him. Yeah, because right now I'm in the midst of asking. We're possibly on Reason and Theology trying to get a debate. So it's going to be a tag team debate. Now Gary hasn't agreed or answered back, so I don't know if it's going to happen. But hopefully we can get one scholar and one layman. So it's going to be Gary Habermas if he agrees, and Phil Bear, again, assuming everybody agrees to this. And then also on the atheist side, debating the resurrection, James Fodor and Juan from Modern Atheism, who's in the chat. So again, we're still trying to work out the details, see if that can happen. But definitely, when I reach out to him for that to follow up, I'll let him know about your video.
Yeah, we've had a few more questions in the past.
Let's finish off the.
Yeah, let's finish off. Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
And then I'll come back to the questions. So, all right. So number 10. We just went over that, didn't we?
We did. Yeah, I think we're on number 11.
So number 11. Occasionally, some early Christians engaged in disruptive behavior and faced consequences as a result. Now, just before I get to this, I do want to throw in my own quick take here and see if you can respond to this as well. But so I know that Gary Habermas is very careful in the way he words things, right? No, the minimal facts approach to the resurrection, it's not based on proving anyone actually died for their belief. That's actually totally irrelevant to his case. He's arguing his minimal facts are based on the fact that they were provably willing to die. And you get that same impact from that, because nobody willingly is willing to die for a lie. But my thing is, even beyond just proving the willingness to die, I think they were also provably willing to suffer for their beliefs and risk death kind of thing. So it's the suffering and being willing to suffer and or die that really is the case and is provable for the earliest disciples. So yeah, what's your take on this notion about disruptive behavior and their willingness to face consequences?
Yeah, and I'm looking through my outline for my own video because I did talk about this at some length, and I don't remember what happened with that. I may have taken that out of my video, but yeah, I do. So I'm gonna speak a little bit imprecisely. So I encourage people to look at the video just because I may be misquoting myself, and I'm looking through the notes as we're talking about this. But we do have fairly early attestations that there were theological reasons for persecuting Christianity. So we know that if you take out the Bible and the Book of Acts, or even if you believe that Stephen, who was, I think, the first martyr in the Bible, was not actually martyred, we do have a lot of evidence that there was other penalties for the early Christians, for the nascent community that was forming at that time. For example, we know that, again, Talmud 43a states that Jesus and 5 of Jesus' disciples were all killed at the same time, were all executed for following Jesus, for inciting the people of Israel to apostasy. We also know that there were people I think Tacitus wrote about a lot of public executions of Christianity, and I want to say in the 60s. So I think this was the mid 60s. So this is only essentially about 25 years after the death of Jesus. So and I think Tacitus talks about Nero's persecution of the Christians, and this was definitely persecution because of being scapegoated for this fire in Rome. Paulogia does go into this. Now, this has showed up in online debates in a few contexts, but the point is that people bring this up as an example that Christians were in fact not being killed for theological claims. They were not being killed for theological reasons, but were instead being killed so that Nero had a scapegoat for this Christian community. So the reason why this is there are a few reasons why this is problematic. Number one, it ignores all the New Testament evidence, which again, we can just kind of gloss over because I'm sure that's been addressed elsewhere and most people know about that as well. Number two, it ignores also the Jewish polemical literature, which suggests that indeed Jesus and anyone who followed Jesus was, subjected to the same penalties and the same persecution. Number three, there's only a fairly narrow gap in time that is unaccounted, which is about maybe the 40s, where we don't really have any documentation of people being persecuted for their beliefs. So it's unlikely that Nero could have manufactured this degree of hatred and scapegoating for the Christians ex nihilo. It's much more likely that for political expediency, Nero was blaming the Christians, who are an already despised group. And in fact, Tacitus sort of endorses this by saying these were already a despised class. I think that the despised class is the words that I think it's Tacitus who uses this characterization of the Christians. So I think, again, I'm okay giving Paulogia a check mark here, but I think it's mistaken to sort of endorse this claim that Christians were not being persecuted for any theological reason. Moreover, the argumentation that Nero didn't blame Christians for any theological reason is also flawed because he's, after all, endorsing the persecution of this group that was specifically, strictly theologically identified. There were no other markers of the Christian class other than their theological beliefs. So in other words, there were not like ethnic markers. They were not yet divided geographically into any subgroup. So we also know that there was sort of this antipathy towards the Jews and the Christians in the time of around 49 or 50, when a lot of the Jews and Christians were expelled from Rome very forcibly. I think I'm losing some of my articulacy because it's been about 2 hours.
Yeah,
so I don't want to talk too much longer, but and it's only because I tend to be less articulate after 2 hours, I'm sure. But anyways, but I'm okay with giving Paulogia a check mark on this in terms of it satisfying the minimal criteria that Paulogia sets forth.
Fair enough. Okay, last but not least, so number 12, centuries later in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome. So this is the great persecution of the Emperor Diocletian, ruler of the Tetrarchy. But it gained legal protection 10 years later in 313 AD with Constantine, the Roman Empire's first official religion. So he's talking about the Edict of Milan, which gave them legal toleration. And then eventually the Roman Empire, Christianity became its official religion after that, marking its transformation toward the institution we know today. Now, the only thing I want to say on this, and we've been sort of focusing on the comparison to the minimal facts, but beyond this, these 12 mundane events, the minimal witnesses hypothesis, is also meant to account for 4 secular facts, if I can find them right here from Paulogia, right? So I didn't see any need to go into it for the most part, right? With proto-Christianity, whatever he means by proto, but nonetheless, Christianity emerged in the 1st century, check mark. Letters attributed to Paul among early congregations. I could nitpick him. Paulogia likes to nitpick me and Gary Habermas, so I'm going to nitpick him. They're actually epistles, not letters proper. But anyways, written narratives about Jesus and his followers were created and distributed. Of course, these are all facts. But it's on this one. If his mundane event number 12 is meant to provide a possible account that as to why there are 2.5 billion people currently identifying as Christians today, this is an utter failure, right? Because even if we grant this as a fact, which it is, this is all secular history that everybody would agree with, this can't account for why there are 2.5 billion Christians today. I think he's just stretched. His theory doesn't account for that, and it doesn't need to, right? If you're trying to account for the origins of Christianity, you don't need to try to account for, why there are 2.5 billion Christians today, because that involves a whole bunch of causal chains, some of which are causally connected to this event, some of which aren't. Because there's more than Christianity outside of Roman Christianity in the West and stuff like that. So I just think he totally misses the mark in citing this fact as though it can account for why we have 2.5 billion Christians today. But yeah, what do you want to say on this? And also, does it account for all of Christianity as we have it today?
Yeah, I mean, I actually admire that Paulogia puts this in, because I think this is sort of a persuasive argument, and it's more of a broad argument, and it brings the focus out of the resurrection and kind of makes it a little more broad. So I do like that he brings it up. I do think that there are a lot of posited explanations for why Christianity became so viral. Most people would argue that, particularly for the resources that were available at the time, Christianity is probably the most effective grassroots movement in history. I think this is not really adequately explained by any current explanation, but there are a lot of explanations. Now, as is typical in any academic field, whenever you have like 20 or 30 different explanations for why something happened, that means that none of those explanations really has sufficient explanatory power to displace the rest of the explanations. So my point here is that there are a lot of reasons why people will argue that Christianity was very, very effective. People have a bunch of different explanations. None of those are particularly persuasive. And that's the reason why no single explanation has been adopted as the main one. Now, I will say that this is important because it does dovetail into my own personal minimal facts, okay? And those are more broadly sociologically relevant. And I think they make different points about Christianity that go beyond just a single event. So if you take the resurrection as a single event, I think it's a little bit too hyper-focused, as I've said in my videos, and that's the argument that I've made. So I like that this fact does broaden the scope just a little bit, and so I do appreciate that. If it's okay, if there's time, I'll just quickly run through kind of my own minimal facts, and I'm working on a video about this as well.
Yeah, one thing I'll just say to end this before you do that. The point I made, I appealed to a documentary by Dr. Diarmaid McCullough in my Paulogia project, either part one. And one of my things is that, sure, this was a pivotal event in perhaps Western Christianity, and therefore Christianity as a whole. And I think it's good to expand it if you want to account for Christianity as a whole. But I just think it's very reductionistic and stuff, and misses actually, because if we're talking about the 7th century AD, believe it or not, there were an equal amount of Christians under the Pope as there was under, I think the Eastern Christian quote unquote Pope was called the Emir, and there were the same number of Christians under his command in the East, in the Eastern Church, right, going all the way up to India and
Interesting,
starting from Syria, even into Tang Dynasty China, right? So they had no association with Western Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Pope, or anything. And this leader, I think he was called the Emir. It might have been some other term, but he was essentially their leader, their spiritual leader, in the same way for us the Pope is, and the same amount of Christians. They had nothing to do with this event. So that's the only thing, is I think it kind of makes it reductionistic and only focuses on one half, literally, of the Christian church. So yeah, that's my only criticism there. But yeah,
that's great, interesting stuff. I haven't done a lot of research on that, but that sounds very interesting.
Awesome. Well, yeah, over to you. So you wanted to show your own set of minimal facts kind of thing. So
yeah. So this is a video that I'm working on, and this is just sort of my set of minimal facts that I think broadens the context to a more sociological debate. So, all right, so minimal fact number 1, Jesus had a unique, radical, and lofty, but cohesive and thoroughly developed moral system. That alone is unusual. Most moral systems are developed over generations of thinkers, so I think that's interesting. Minimal fact number 2, there is a large number of secondary sources about Jesus relative to other religions. So we have a lot of attestations. We have about, in the first 100 years of Christianity, we have about 12 other writers who attested that, hey, this stuff is all true. So that's minimal fact number 2. Minimal fact number 3 is there is an early creedal attestation of the resurrection. Now, this is something I go into in this video, and we've talked about this a lot, so I guess I won't talk too much about that. Minimal fact number 4, secondary attestations around Jesus do seem to be endeavoring to make factual arguments. For instance, you have Quadratus of Athens, who talks about the healing miracles of Jesus being robust, being actually physiologic changes, and being changes that persist into the living memory of the culture that was alive in the 2nd century. We also have people like Aristides, who was writing around the same time, that talks about how, they're not following a mythology, they're following because actual things that they observed happened, and that there was this community of actual observers that at least did persist to the beginning of the 2nd century. So there was the sense Jesus was not mythological, nor were his healings. Minimal fact number 5, many religious sects many religions have sects acknowledging Jesus. So the Buddhists call Jesus a possible bodhisattva. Jesus is a yogi or avatar is viewed as a palatable conceptualization in Hinduism. We have in Islam, Jesus is a prophet. This is very uncommon for any other religious figure. Minimal fact number 6, I think we're on. The narrative around Jesus is the only theological narrative that I'm aware of with antagonistic acknowledgement. Now, I did a fairly deep dive into this, and I could not find other antagonistic acknowledgements around any other theological narrative, maybe with the possible exception of the Baha'i faith, because one of their reported miracles that is the most common miracle for Baha'i faith is the rapid spread, and that is acknowledged by antagonistic sources. The next minimal fact is Jesus is the only figure who's named in canonical Jewish literature who performed acts of magic or wonders without the explicit authority of God. The closest thing that you have to Jesus is those Pharaoh magicians who threw down their snakes, and their snakes turned into, threw down their sticks, and their sticks turned into snakes. But these are not named individuals. So as far as I'm aware, Jesus is the only figure named in canonical Jewish literature who actually did perform a magical act, who was not doing it with the authority of God. I think that's at least fascinating and intriguing. Next minimal fact, after the death of Jesus, there was a major liturgical and theological experience for Jews. Now, this is important because as an atheist, when I looked at the end of Second Temple Judaism, so the year between 30 and 70 CE, to me it was interesting that all the miracles around the Yom Kippur atonement ritual all stopped. They all stopped all at once. They all stopped in around the year 30, and they all stopped until around the year 70. So we know that there was that. And as an atheist, I would have expected that the death of Jesus should not have had a theological impact on the Jews. So I was very surprised to find such a large body of Jewish literature writing in the last 4 decades of the Second Great Temple that endorsed that there was a significant shift in the theological experience of the Jews. This is something else that I've done a whole video about. Next minimal fact, we already talked about, the early spread of Christianity does seem to defy explanation. And the last minimal fact, the narrative of Jesus does have several mysteries built into it that are difficult to explain. For one, the followers seem to be emboldened after the death of Jesus. Number 2, James seems to be converted after the death of Jesus. Number 3, the empty tomb. Number 4, Peter had an experience, even among very skeptical atheists. They admit that Peter had some experience. And Paul had some sort of theologically impactful experience. So I kind of take all those mysteries around the narrative of Jesus, around the death of Jesus, and I kind of lump them into one minimal fact. But to me, these are sort of the more sociologically impactful minimal facts about Christianity that I think, I wouldn't say that I'm theologically committed, but if somebody basically said, here's $5,000, you can bet this $5,000 on any religious tradition being correct. And you can bet, and you put it on like a roulette wheel of all the religious traditions. Where would you put this, your $5,000? No question, I would put it on Christianity. The attestations are early. Jesus is acknowledged in other religious traditions. We have all this other sociological evidence. We have a lot of we've got the attestations that come early. We have the creeds that come early. We have a lot of secondary sources. We have a lot of antagonistic sources. And we have some very, very unique things about Jesus, both the way he was treated in the Jewish literature and the way he's treated in religions around the world, that I think together make the perspective quite compelling to say that at least the evidence around Christianity is not flimsy. And as an atheist, that was always my sort of pre-existing belief system, was that every religion has really flimsy evidence. Now I think my perspective is, at least it's a more nuanced perspective. So hopefully those minimum facts are interesting, and hopefully that's something that at least some of your viewers can look forward to in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated that. So, yeah, at this time, I will. We do have some audience questions. I know you said you're kind of getting towards the end. Do you want to just answer a few audience questions before we go, or
let me answer this quick one from Modern Atheism. If Joseph buried Jesus' body out of doing a good thing, he should have buried the other two thieves. Don't you agree? So, number one, I don't know that those thieves were Jewish. I don't. Were they Jewish? Were
I would
those?
assume so. Yeah, like in Jerusalem, getting at the time of the Passover. I don't think it explicitly says though.
I don't think we know what happened to the bodies of the thieves. That's an interesting question, though. That's a very thoughtful question. I hadn't considered that, but I would say if they're Jewish, then he may have not had as much of an allegiance. But I'm sure if they were Jewish, the reason why I think the Jesus burial was likely more in accordance with Jewish tradition is because if you read the Talmud, it talks about the death of Jesus being done for, there at least was some Jewish theological organized involvement around that. I'm not saying that, anyone's, the narrative doesn't to me go beyond that point, but I do think that you have to say that there was at least some Jewish theological community involvement. So if there was theological community involvement in the death of Jesus, it stands to reason that that involvement would have transcended that death and extended to the actual burial of Jesus. So I think that's the point that I'm making there.
All right, awesome. And one last one from him as well. What do you think of this? How people react to a schizophrenic person nowadays is different to how ancient people would react to such. Back then, they would respect Paul as a mystic who gets visions from God. So this is something Richard Carrier often brings up in his debates. But what's your take there?
This is presentism. So it's easy to say that, oh, of course, now we know better. We wouldn't be taken by somebody who's schizophrenic. But I think it's exceedingly hard to look at Paul over a sea of 2,000 years and say that Paul had or did not have a specific diagnosis. I think that's exceedingly difficult. But at the very least, you have to look at Paul's works as works that are very cogent, that seem very persuasive. It would be extremely unusual for a schizophrenic to make those works in a way that's that's compelling. Moreover, if you've ever talked to anyone with schizophrenia, it's extremely difficult to get them to stay on topic. Schizophrenia is not just a delusional disorder, it's a disorder of thinking. That's why you have social skills that collapse in schizophrenia. That's why you have failures and other cognitive resources around schizophrenia. So just saying, well, if you have a delusion, couldn't you convince other people now, back then more easily than now? I think that's a persuasive argument, but it does ascribe to the bias of presentism. I think it's a very insightful and thoughtful question, though. But I personally, having had experiences with people who are schizophrenic, both in a clinical setting and also in a non-clinical setting, it's extremely difficult to have a conversation with them where they stay on topic. It's hard to get them to convince you of anything. I mean, they're not very convincing. They're kind of all over the place, and you try and get them to focus, or you try and ask follow-up questions. You can have shared psychotic disorders, but that almost happens with one person who has a little bit of a borderline psychiatric disturbance or some of underlying organic psychosis, and that almost always happens when there's a long-term exposure. So if I take somebody who's schizophrenic and put somebody in a room alone with them to live with them as their roommate for several months, it's likely that they'll get to the point where maybe some shared delusions will happen, but it's not super easy, and it doesn't. And I would say if you know anything about schizophrenic people, they're just not very persuasive in general. Very good question, though. These are very thoughtful questions from modern atheism, so I really appreciate them.
Yeah, Juan's a great guy. As I said, I've been on his channel before, so he always asks great critical questions that take critical thought and are very charitable. So, yeah, as from what I see, I think that's it for the questions in the chat marked with a Q. So I think we've kind of answered everything. So yeah, I do want to say thank you so much for coming on, Tavo. As I said, your original video, I was very impressed with your level of knowledge and the research you've done into these matters. So I hope you enjoyed your time on your end.
I really have. You're extremely insightful. You're a very kind debater. I thought your interchange with Paulogia over the span of several videos was very courteous. So I want to compliment you from that. A lot of these debates do get very acerbic very quickly. So I'm really glad that you've been and you've been extremely kind. You've been a very generous host and very gracious to me throughout the duration of this video. So I'm very pleased with all that stuff. And I hope we keep in touch. And I hope this is one collaboration among several.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. Any topics that you want to do, including delving deeper in this one, or who knows, maybe you've had a great rapport with modern atheism. Maybe you guys could do a debate or a discussion show sometime, if you guys ever want to. But yeah, I think it was great. I enjoyed it, and I just want to echo your sentiments about charitability, because I know there has been going back and forth between Paulogia and also an atheist, the Rabyd Atheist. I've sort of given up on the Rabyd Atheist. I think he's sort of set in his mind that, yeah, me and Gary are liars. We're purposefully trying to deceive people. But there's still hope for Paulogia. I know he's working on a video in November, and I hope that he treats Gary and I in charitability. Look, the video that I did with Gary responding to various skeptical objections, there were several scholars and skeptical laymen that we were responding to. And that was Gary's idea. I didn't pitch doing a show. I just wanted answers to some of the issues that had come up. And he said, well, hey, I want to help people if I can. So why don't we make this a show? You know, you put together all the skeptical objections from the various skeptics out there, and I'll address them. I want them to know the truth as to what happened. And it was his idea not to name names out of charity. He didn't want that video to come across as kind of an attack video or something. He just wanted it to be, look, here's the substantive objection. How do I respond to it? So I would just ask, yeah, let's not try to nitpick each other. If somebody miscommunicates or says something wrong, let's look beyond what are they intending to say. And on that front, I think that'll improve our dialogue between the two sides. So yeah, I just want to end off with that. And thanks again, Tavo, for coming on, and God bless everybody.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. Thanks for having me. Do you have just a few minutes afterwards, after we close the chat, just to do a bit of a wrap-up conversation? Is there a way to do that?
So you mean like privately, you're saying, or?
Yeah, just you can call my phone. Or, okay, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, we can do it on here after. I'll just hit the end stream, and then we can chat for a few minutes.
Perfect. That'd be great. Yeah.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.